hands around Gravenhage. For a moment he was a tow-headed, round-eyed boy again, clumping in wooden shoes along the edge of tulip fields. But there were no canals here. The flat land, stretching into the darkening west, was spotted with patches of cactus and leather-leaved Venerian plants. Amid the windmills, low domes protruded from the earth, indicating that the dwellings of Rathole were, appropriately, partly underground. He drove into the place. There were no streets as such, but there were avenues between lines of heavy chains strung to short iron posts, evidently as handholds against the wind. The savage gale piled dust and sand in drifts against the domes, then, shifting slightly, swept them clean again. There was no one moving abroad, but just inside the community Jan found half a dozen men in a group, clinging to one of the chains and waving to him. He pulled the ground car to a stop beside them, stuck his pipe in a pocket of his plastic suit, donned his helmet, and got out. The wind almost took him away before one of them grabbed him, and he was able to grasp the chain himself. They gathered around him. They were swarthy, black-eyed men with curly hair. One of them grasped his hand. "Bienvenido, señor," said the man. Jan recoiled and dropped the man's hand. All the Orangeman blood he claimed, protest and outraged. Spaniards! All these men were Spaniards! Jan recovered himself at once. He had been reading too much ancient history during his leisure hours. The hot monotony of Venus was beginning to affect his brain. It had been 500 years since the Netherlands revolted against Spanish rule. A lot of water over the dams since then. A look at the men around him, the sound of their chatter, convinced him that he need not try German or Hollandish here. He fell back on international language. "Do you speak English?" he asked. The man brightened, but shook his head. "No hablo inglés," he said, "pero el médico lo habla. Venga conmigo." He gestured for Jan to follow him and started off, pulling his way against the wind along the chain. Jan followed, and the other men fell behind in single file. 100 meters further on, they turned, descended some steps, and entered one of the half-buried domes. A gray-haired, bearded man was in the well-lighted room, apparently the living room of a home, with a young woman. "El médico," said the man who had greeted Jan, gesturing. "Él habla inglés." He went out, shutting the airlock door behind him. "You must be the man from Oostpoort," said the bearded man, holding out his hand. "I am Dr. Sanchez. We are very grateful you have come." "I thought for a while I wouldn't make it," said Jan ruefully, removing his Venus helmet. "This is Mrs. Murillo," said Sanchez. The woman was a Spanish blonde, full-lipped and beautiful, with golden hair and dark liquid eyes. She smiled at Jan. "Encantada de conocerlo, señor," she greeted him. "Is this the patient, doctor?" asked Jan, astonished. She looked in the best of health. "No, the patient is in the next room," answered Sanchez. "Well, as much as I'd like to stop for a pipe, we'd better start at once," said Jan. "It's a hard drive back, and blastoff can't be delayed." The woman seemed to sense his meaning. She turned and called, "Diego!" A boy appeared in the door, a dark-skinned, sleepy-eyed boy of about 8. He yawned. Then, catching sight of the big Dutchman, he opened his eyes wide and smiled. The boy was healthy-looking, alert, but the mark of the Venus shadow was on his face. There was a faint mottling, a crisscross of dead white lines. Mrs. Murillo spoke to him rapidly in Spanish, and he nodded. She zipped him into a Venus suit and fitted a small helmet on his head. "Good luck, amigo," said Sanchez, shaking Jan's hand again. "Thanks," replied Jan. He donned his own helmet. "I'll need it, if the trip over was any indication." Jan and Diego made their way back down the chain to the ground car. There was a score of men there now, and a few women. They let the pair go through and waved farewell as Jan swung the ground car around and headed back eastward. It was easier driving with the wind behind him. and Jan hit 100 kilometers an hour several times before striking the rougher ground of Den Hoorn. Now, if he could only find a way over the bluff raised by that last quake. The ground of Den Hoorn was still shivering. Jan did not realize this until he had to brake the ground car almost to a stop at one point, because it was not shaking in severe periodic shocks as it had earlier. It quivered constantly like the surface of quicksand. The ground far ahead of him had a strange color to it. Jan, watching for the cliff he had to skirt and scale, had picked up speed over some fairly even terrain, but now he slowed again, puzzled. There was something wrong ahead. He couldn't quite figure it out. Diego, beside him, had sat quietly so far, peering eagerly through the windshield, not saying a word. Now suddenly he cried in high, thin terror, "Cuidado! Cuidado! Un abismo!" Jan saw it at the same time and hit the brakes so hard the ground car would have stood on its nose had its wheels been smaller. They skidded to a stop. The chasm that had caused him such a long detour before had widened, evidently in the big quake that had hit earlier. Now it was a canyon half a kilometer wide. 5 meters from the edge, he looked over the blank space at the far wall and could not see a bottom. Cursing choice Dutch profanity, Jan wheeled the ground car northward and drove along the edge of the abyss as fast as he could. He wasted a half an hour before realizing it was getting no narrower. There was no point in going back southward. It might be 100 kilometers long or 1,000, but he could never reach the end of it and the thread of the tumbled rocks of Den Hoorn to Oostpoort before the G-boat blast-off. There was nothing to do but turn back to Rathole and see if some other way could not be found. Jan sat in the half-buried room and enjoyed the luxury of a pipe filled with some of Theodorus Niemeyer's mild tobacco. Before him, Dr. Sanchez sat with crossed legs, cleaning his fingernails with a scalpel. Diego's mother talked to the boy in low, liquid tones in the corner of a room. Jan was at a loss to know how people whose technical knowledge was so skimpy as it was, obviously in Rathole, were able to build these semi-underground dunes to resist the earth shocks that came from Den Hoorn. But this one showed no signs of stress. A religious print and a small pencil sketch of Senor Murillo, probably done by the boy, were awry on the inward curving walls, but that was all. Jan felt justifiably exasperated at these Spanish-speaking people. If some effort had been made to take the boy to Oostpoort from here, instead of calling on us to send a car, Den Hoorn could have been crossed before the crack opened, he pointed out. An effort was made, replied Sanchez quietly. Perhaps you do not fully realize our position here. We have no engines except the stationary generators that give us current for our air conditioning and our utilities. They are powered by the windmills. We do not have gasoline engines for vehicles, and all our vehicles are operated by hand. You push them? Demanded Jan incredulously. No, you've seen pictures of the pump cars that were once used on terrestrial railroads. Ours are powered like that, but we cannot operate them when the Venerian wind is blowing. By the time I diagnosed the Venus shadow in Diego, the wind was coming up, and we had no way to get him to Oostpoort. Grunted Jan. He shifted uncomfortably and looked at the pair in the corner. The blonde head was bent over the boy protectingly, and over his mother's shoulder, Diego's black eyes returned Jan's glance. If the disease has just started, the boy could wait for the next Earthship, couldn't he? Asked Jan. I said I had just diagnosed it, not that it just started, senor, corrected Sanchez. As you know, the trip to Earth takes 145 days, and it can be only started when two planets are in the right positions in their orbits. Have you ever seen anyone die of the Venus shadow? Yes, I have, replied Jan in a low voice. He had seen 2 people die of it, and it had not been pleasant. Medical men thought it was a deficiency disease, but they had not traced down the deficiency responsible. Treatment by vitamins, diet, antibiotics, infrared, ultraviolet rays, all were useless.